By the end of this campaign season, the three presidential candidates had largely converged in what they were saying about China. None of them were suggesting a dramatic departure from the status quo.
You listen to the campaign, you don't hear about the future. What is the future that you're going to sell me? It's always more China.
For Xi Jinping to cope with him, so obviously it would be much more difficult for Taiwan. We now have a minority president here.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Tomasz Koper, sitting in for Divya Gopalan. On January 13th, the Taiwanese went to the polls to choose their future president and lawmakers. The three-way presidential race went in favor of the current Vice President Lai Ching-te, securing an unprecedented third term for the ruling Democratic Progressive Party. The legislative election, however, saw the DPP lose their parliamentary majority. Today, when the proverbial dust has settled, we'll be taking a cool-headed look at the results and what they mean for the country, the region, and the world. Helping us in that task, we welcome Professor Fu-kuo Liu from the National Chengchi University, who is also the director of the Taiwan Center for Security Studies. Professor, were you at all surprised by the election results?
Surprised to some extent, because from all the pre-election polls showed Vice President Lai and his team was going to win. That was a very clear message. But the surprise I personally had is something related to KMT and TPP, because another poll showed 60% of voters in Taiwan thinks this government should be changed. So counting on Mr. Hou Yu-ih and Mr. Ko Wen-je's vote altogether, both of them is all about 60% vote. So obviously this is something surprised me, because as a result, the poll does carry such a factual development. We now have a minority president here.
And for an analysis of the recent three-way presidential race and its outcomes, Divya Gopalan sat down with Sara Newland, an assistant professor of government at Smith College in Massachusetts.
Yeah, so Taiwan often has multiple people running for office, but this was really the first time since 2000 when it's been a really contested three-way race with three potentially viable candidates. And there was a lot of excitement, obviously, in the blue camp around the idea that two of those candidates might cooperate, right, might form a unity ticket. Ultimately, what wound up happening is that the sort of blue-leaning vote was split between Hou Yu-ih and Ko Wen-je. And, you know, if that hadn't happened, I think there's a good chance we would see a different outcome in this election. I think Lai Ching-te might well have lost if there had been a unity ticket. So the fact that there were three candidates, I think, was really important. I think it also added something different to the policy conversation. Although Ko Wen-je came in last in the election, I think he did highlight the fact that there are a lot of people in Taiwan politics, potentially especially young voters, who really don't feel well represented by either the DPP and the KMT right now and are looking for some kind of alternative. And, you know, if 25% of the population feels that way, that's going to have a significant impact on Taiwan's politics moving forward.
You know, looking in from the outside, most of the chatter was about each of the candidates' stance on China or what their party will do going forward with China. Do you think there was enough attention paid to domestic issues for the Taiwan population? So
this is very much politics as usual for Taiwan presidential elections. Every election winds up being dominated by discussion of the cross-strait issue. Local politics is much more at the forefront in the local elections, so the mayoral elections, the city council elections. And so in some ways, this election didn't feel that different. And if anything, it felt like there was more attention to domestic political issues in this election than there was 4 years ago when the Hong Kong protests loomed really large and the question of what Taiwan's future might look like I think felt like a more existential choice between the two candidates. They were presenting starkly contrasting visions of what they wanted Taiwan's relationship with China to look like. By the end of this campaign season, the three presidential candidates had largely converged in what they were saying about China. None of them were suggesting a dramatic departure from the status quo. And that maybe rang more true for some candidates than for others. But in some ways, I think there was, if anything, a little bit more discussion of things like housing, wages, some of the sort of bread and butter domestic issues in this election than there have been in past elections.
So, Professor Liu, Sarah mentioned in the video that it's a feature of Taiwanese elections that they inevitably focus on China. And we know that both Beijing and Washington were watching these elections very closely. So what do you think is the geopolitical impact that we're going to see from these elections in the coming 4 years?
Just remember, one day before our election, last Friday, the U.S. Congress passed two significant new laws related to Taiwan, encouraging Taiwan and trying to help Taiwan to be part of international membership inside International Monetary Fund, as well as a World Bank and related financial institution. So if the U.S. increases such a support, high postures support to Taiwan, and obviously engaging into these relations between Taiwan and China, obviously, like before, it would potentially raise up this geopolitical tension much further.
Well, much like in the Taiwanese elections themselves, we will be coming back to the topic of China throughout this show. But for now, let's take a look at how the parliamentary elections played out. Most international media coverage focused on the presidential race, which will dictate the general direction of Taiwan's foreign policy. But last Saturday, the Taiwanese have also chosen their lawmakers. The ruling DPP has lost its parliamentary majority and are now almost on equal footing with the now opposition KMT. Divya Gopalan asked Michael Turton, a longtime Taiwan watcher and Taipei Times columnist, about the future of the KMT.
I think they're going to keep shrinking. Han Guoyu, super popular, turbocharged, 38%, right? Before him, Zhu Liren got 35%, and now here's Ho, was actually a terrible candidate, it turned out. Very, very lackluster. They got 33%. They're basically getting their base in every election. And this election, they decided that would be their strategy, because the KMT right now looks like it's rich on paper. You see their asset list and they look wealthy, but a lot of that's frozen. So I think that's what they set out to secure this election. We consolidate the base. So they secured the base, picked up their funding. Now they can go forward at the regional level.
So what is fundamentally the issue with the Kuomintang party that voters are not being, turned by them?
Well, they're pro-China, and that's an issue. But more importantly, there's nothing that you listen to the KMT and you don't hear about the future. What is the future that you're going to sell me? It's always more China, right? If they had talked, and Ho did this, he came out with, hey, let's raise the minimum wage, you might recall. And the DPP responded right away with their own raises. We need to see a lot more of that before the KMT can come back at the national level.
Professor Liu, we've heard this framing of the most recent election, both from Beijing and to some extent from KMT, that it's a choice between war and peace. If the DPP wins, it's war. If the KMT wins, it's peace because they have a better relationship. But we've seen a more assertive stance from the KMT throughout the campaign and a more softer approach to China issues from the DPP as well, to the point where they actually run pretty close. So is it really a peaceful choice, the KMT, for Taiwan, if the KMT had won the presidential election? Would there really be a big difference in the eyes of Beijing?
Of course, the basic standpoint between KMT and DPP are somewhat different. KMT would agree from the history, they are the one making this 1992 consensus with CCP in China. DPP came later. So that was the reason why DPP for long suggested they would not recognize 1992 consensus. Without this consensus, there is no political common ground between DPP and CCP. So without this common solid ground, it would be really hard for them to consider to take up such a dialogue. But of course, for China, basically Taiwan is relatively small from their eye. But of course, they want to utilize peaceful means rather than military means to integrate or unify Taiwan at this point. So very importantly, after the outcome shows for Beijing, they would not have any choices other than just setting up a red line to the next government.
And that's because a lot of reporting on Taiwan in general, and this election in particular, was done through the prism of China and its repeated threats to annex Taiwan by force if necessary. We asked Ivy Kwek, a China fellow at the International Crisis Group, about what recent changes in China's military command could mean for Taiwan.
So I think that, yeah, we're certainly hearing a lot of news coming from China, from Beijing, on sort of the kind of volatility that the leadership seems to be facing. I think that there is certainly some uncertainty in terms of at the leadership level that Beijing is facing currently. I think that there's also different factors such as the struggling economy and the other problems, other domestic problems, such as the housing crisis, that might have increased some of the discontent from the Chinese publics towards their leadership. I wouldn't say that necessarily means that the political leadership of President Xi is now in danger. I think that is a little bit of a stretch to reach that conclusion. But I think that Beijing is definitely trying to sort out some of the problems that they are facing by changing some of their leaders. And I would say that this is perhaps a moment of transition as well as they make those changes.
Professor Liu, so far, following this election, we've seen a pretty muted Chinese response, pretty low-key response compared to other situations in the past. For example, the surprise visit by then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, or following President Tsai's visit to the United States, when China staged large-scale military drills around Taiwan. So far, we've not seen anything like that following this election. What does that tell us?
From our understanding and also the previous practice from Chinese government, obviously, if something is serious, they will not immediately pop up whatever negative or positive message. They will normally go through very thorough analysis internally, going through several rounds of decision-making process. Finally, it has to come up in certain critical time. I think looking in the next 2 months, there are two significant times. One is before Chinese New Year. Xi Jinping and also other top leaders in China will take this important timing to set and address some guideline for Taiwan policy. But everyone knows, according to Chinese political practice, in March, when two congresses meet, and that was the time that was set a right tone on certain policy, especially Taiwan policy. I personally observe that would be the critical time to observe what things comes to Taiwan.
Well, let's bring in one more important piece of this puzzle into the conversation, because no discussion of cross-strait relations can ignore the star-spangled elephant in the room, the United States. Washington has long maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying potential involvement in the case of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But does that policy still hold water in 2024? For an answer, we once again turn to Michael Turton, a longtime Taiwan watcher and Taipei Times columnist.
Well, the strategic ambiguity was always whether or not the U.S. would intervene in the Taiwan scenario, but I think it's actually meaningless, and I've been saying this for years, right? The Biden said 3 or 4 times, we're going to go in, and we have a commitment to that. And everyone interpreted him as being, I was like, Joe, you don't know what the rules are. We don't have that in our laws. I think it's intentional. He was in the Senate for many years before he was president. He knows all these rules, right? I think he was in on the Taiwan Relations Act voting. I mean, he knows this stuff. So what he says is what. And in any case, it doesn't matter because China is preparing for the U.S. to intervene and for Japan to intervene. So strategic ambiguity is really meaningless because everyone's already prepared to go to war. They've already signaled that. So when China finally makes a move, the U.S. is going to intervene. The one fear I have, and I think a lot of us quietly have, is if Trump gets elected. So this year, actually, I don't think anything is going to happen. I think they'll wait and see whether or not Trump gets elected. And if Trump gets elected, then they might move.
So Michael Turton mentioned a change in political leadership in the United States, but so far we've seen pretty bipartisan support for Taiwan in the United States, both from the Republicans and the Democrats. Now, do you think that Beijing is really waiting to see what will happen in the U.S. elections later this year before they spring to action?
Beginning of last year, many policymakers or policy advisors in East Asia, Japan, China, Korea, and Taiwan, we have already looked into the possibility of return of Donald Trump to the White House. Obviously, China is very much looking into this, and the worst scenario, of course, if Donald Trump does return back to the White House, it will serve as a big headache for Xi Jinping to cope with him. So obviously, it will be much more difficult for Taiwan, as you just mentioned. We have a bipartisan support from the Congress, Capitol Hill, but government change may make the process more complicated on the U.S. side. But I think since now another diplomatic effort between the U.S. and China is engaging, at least after the summit last year, U.S. and China, at least Xi Jinping and Joe Biden can meet and also can call each other to sort things out. At least they can have a direct dialogue channel, while Taiwan does not. And I think this would be the new area for the new government to really put lots of the effort to restart dialoguing with China to make sure everything is manageable.
Okay, let me bring the conversation back to the region again. In an effort to diversify away from economic reliance on China and forge new relationships in the region, Taipei launched its new southbound policy under the Tsai administration. Tran Thi Mong Tuyen, a scholar at the National Cheng Kung University in Taiwan, told us why Taipei and Vietnam could increase cooperation under Lai's leadership.
The new southbound policy was promoted by the President Tsai Ing-wen in 2016 with the aims of fostering the relation between Taiwan and Southeast Asia and South Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. And today, Vietnam has become an important economic and trading partner, and it is the second largest destination for Taiwan's overseas investment. And also, there are more than about 90,000 Taiwanese in Vietnam and over 270,000 of Vietnamese in Taiwan. So it's making a significant impact on the people-to-people tie. We can anticipate to a further strengthening of the bilateral relationship because the new southern policies is already under the DBB. And however, with a new president, we can expect to see some changes in its implementation. And in fact, the DBB focuses on interdependence and aims to reduce the dependence on China economy, so making the further strengthening of relation with Vietnam is entirely understandable.
Professor Liu, we see experts predict that foreign policy under President-elect Lai will be very similar to what we're seeing now under President Tsai. So what are the differences between them? Is it really going to be a straight continuation, or are we going to see new elements, both in the southbound policy and elsewhere in international relations?
In reality, personally, I'm not that optimistic about deepening and also broadening the relations between Taiwan and the so-called new southbound country altogether, because for long, Taiwan's engagement with these countries are more on non-official level. We have engaged in social and other dimension, economic dimension, but it would be really challenging to go beyond to political level of contact with all the country. And especially now, many countries will be looking into what Beijing's perspective, because almost all the country in the southbound dimension have such deep relations with mainland China.
Well, we are quickly running out of time, but before we go, let's bring in one more perspective. South Korea is another country with geopolitical interests in the region and a significant U.S. military presence. Dr. Seong-Hyon Lee from the Harvard University Asia Center told us what we can expect in Seoul-Taipei relations as the DPP takes on another term. Take a listen.
I think it seems only natural for South Korea as a like-minded democracy to strengthen ties with Taiwan while still maintaining its diplomatic relations with the PRC. In South Korea, it's also true that Taiwan has long been overshadowed by China. The time has come to balance this a bit by both sides engaging in the most substantial bilateral civilian exchanges and outreach first. And I think there is enough reason for that. Taiwan is South Korea's sixth largest trading partner, and 43% of South Korea's trade goes through the Taiwan Strait, making peace and stability in this region crucial for South Korea as well. President Yoon has clarified that, for example, South Korea's role in a Taiwan Strait contingency that, we've been recently talking a lot about this, right? This hypothetical situation, which we don't want to see happen, but we need to be prepared. So that's why we need to discuss. So South Korea's role in this specific circumstance would be to deter North Korea first, given the increasing likelihood that North Korea may launch an attack on South Korea if China decides to invade Taiwan. And in the Pacific region, Taiwan is considered part of the Southern Theater, while the Korean Peninsula, where South Korea belongs to, is in the Northern Theater. So it is crucial that while Taiwan defends itself in such a scenario, South Korea must also protect the Northern Theater of the Indo-Pacific region against North Korea. And furthermore, you just mentioned about China. If North Korea attacks South Korea, China, which is North Korea's official military ally, is likely to become involved.
Professor Liu, it is usually Japan that gets media coverage in the context of U.S. China rivalry. And we've certainly definitely covered Japan extensively over this election period. So how much is South Korea a player in this U.S. China Taiwan dynamic?
It is very rare to see Korean government engaging into this complicated issue in the region, especially something related to Taiwan, because, excuse me, on their corner, they have so much trouble for them to look after, especially North Korea. And currently, North Korean leaders, Kim Jong-un, already trying to redefine and change the peaceful status with South Korea. And I think early on, because South Korean new president, Yoon, changing the course of policy, putting much more bets on the US side, but in the society, business community is altogether is requesting government to resume better relations with China. So I think South Korean involvement in Taiwan security is limited.
Thank you, Professor Fu-kuo Liu from National Chengchi University, also the director of the Taiwan Center for Security Studies. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for this very educational conversation. And to our viewers at home, if you would like to be a part of the conversation, visit our YouTube channel where you can leave us comments. You can also follow and interact with us on our Instagram. That's the end of today's show. It's been great to have your company. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.